The carriage jolted to a stop before the gates of Ashworth Hall, and Eleanor Vane pressed a gloved hand against her stomach to steady herself, certain that everyone inside the great house could already hear the frantic beating of her heart. She was not the woman they were expecting. She was not the woman anyone was expecting. And if the truth came out before nightfall, she would be sent home in disgrace, dragging her family's name through the mud along with her own. The letter that started it all had arrived at Whitfield Manor 6 weeks earlier, sealed with the crest of the Duke of Ashworth. Eleanor remembered the way her aunt's hands had trembled as she read it aloud at the breakfast table, her voice rising with excitement as she reached the words that mattered most. The Duke wished to begin a courtship with the young woman he had seen at the masquerade in London, the one who wore a silver veil and stood near the garden doors. He did not know her name. He did not need it yet. He asked only that she be sent to his estate so that they might come to know one another away from the noise of society, and that she keep the veil until he himself asked her to remove it. Charlotte Whitfield, Eleanor's cousin, had been the toast of that masquerade. Every eye in the ballroom had followed her that night, and it was assumed by everyone in the family that she was the woman the Duke meant. Lady Whitfield had nearly fainted from joy. A Duke, unmarried and untitled to any scandal, asking for her daughter by name, in a manner of speaking. It was the kind of fortune families dreamed about and rarely received. But Charlotte did not want to go. She had already set her sights on a young viscount she had danced with twice that season, a man with a handsome face and an easy laugh, and she had no interest in traveling to a remote estate to sit across from a duke known throughout London for his coldness and his silence. She wept and refused and threatened to ruin the whole arrangement by writing to the Duke herself and declining on behalf of the family. It was Lord Whitfield who came up with the solution, quietly, over brandy with his wife long after the household had gone to sleep. Eleanor did not learn the details until much later, but she understood enough that night to know her fate had been decided without her. She was the poor relation, taken in after her parents' deaths, given a bed and a place at the table but never quite given a place in the family's heart. She had no suitors of her own, no prospects, and no voice loud enough to refuse when her aunt sat her down and explained, in the gentlest tone she could manage, that Eleanor would go to Ashworth Hall in Charlotte's place. It was only for a short while, her aunt promised. Dukes lost interest quickly. He would grow bored of quiet conversation and modest manners within a month, perhaps 2, and Eleanor would be sent home with a small allowance for her trouble and strict instructions never to speak of it again. No one would be harmed. No one would even know. Eleanor had wanted to refuse. She had opened her mouth to say so, but she thought of the years she had spent grateful for scraps of kindness, and she understood. The way one understands the shape of a cage without needing to see its bars, that refusal was not truly an option being offered to her. So she came to Ashworth Hall wearing her cousin's name and her cousin's veil, carrying nothing that was truly her own, except her fear. The house itself was larger than anything Eleanor had ever seen, its stone face pale gold in the afternoon light, its windows catching the sun like rows of watching eyes. A footman helped her down from the carriage, and she forced her spine straight, the way her aunt had drilled into her during the long ride north. Chin level, shoulders back, speak only when spoken to, and never remove the veil until he says the words himself. She had barely taken 3 steps toward the entrance when the front doors opened and a man stepped out to meet her. He was tall, with dark hair swept back from a face that held none of the coldness she had been warned to expect. His eyes found her immediately, steady and searching, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has waited a long time to see again. "You came," he said, and his voice was quieter than she expected, almost reverent. "I was not entirely certain you would." Eleanor curtsied, grateful for the veil that hid the heat rushing into her cheeks. "Your Grace," she managed. "Thank you for your hospitality." "Julian," he said, "please, we are well past the point of titles between us, I think, even if we have not yet spoken more than a few words at a ball months ago." Eleanor's mind raced. A few words at a ball. She had not been at that masquerade at all. She had been home, mending a torn hem by candlelight, while Charlotte danced beneath chandeliers in London. Whatever exchange had passed between the Duke and the real woman behind that veil, Eleanor knew nothing of it, and the danger of that ignorance settled over her like a stone. "Forgive me," she said carefully. "The journey was long. I find myself forgetting small details I ought to remember." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she could not name it. Concern, perhaps, or something closer to disappointment. But he only nodded and offered his arm to lead her inside, and Eleanor took it because there was nothing else to do. The interior of Ashworth Hall was grand but not cold. warmed by fires in every hearth and soft carpets that muffled her footsteps as they walked. A housekeeper, a stout woman with kind eyes named Mrs. Pruitt, showed her to a bedchamber on the east wing, larger and finer than any room Eleanor had ever slept in. She sat on the edge of the bed once she was alone, and finally allowed herself to breathe. She had survived the first hour. That was something. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, just the two of them at a table long enough to seat 20. Eleanor kept the veil in place as instructed, eating little, answering questions in careful, measured sentences designed to reveal nothing. The Duke did not press her, though she noticed him watching her closely, studying her hands, her posture, the way she held her spoon, as though searching for something specific. "You are different than I remember," he said finally, setting down his glass. Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Different, Your Grace?" "Quieter," he said. "At the masquerade, you spoke with such conviction about the injustice of women being married for their fortunes rather than their character. I have thought of that conversation often these past months." Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. She had never spoken those words. Whoever the Duke had truly met that night, it had not been Charlotte, who cared for little beyond gowns and gossip, and it certainly had not been Eleanor herself. "Perhaps I have grown more careful with my opinions," she offered at last. New surroundings tend to quiet a person. He studied her for a long moment, and she feared he could see straight through the veil to the lie sitting behind her eyes. But then he smiled, small and warm, and the tension in the room eased just slightly. "Then I shall have to earn your opinions back," he said. "I find I miss them already." After dinner, Eleanor excused herself early, claiming exhaustion from the journey, and hurried up the stairs to her chamber with her heart pounding. She did not undress right away. Instead, she sat by the window, looking out over the dark gardens below, turning the strange evening over in her mind. The Duke was not what she had been told to expect. He was not cold. He was not indifferent. He looked at her, even veiled and silent, as though she mattered to him already, and that terrified her more than any anger could have. A soft knock came at her door some time later, and Eleanor rose quickly to answer it, expecting Mrs. Pruitt with fresh linens or a message about the morning schedule. Instead, she found the corridor empty, save for two young maids further down the hall, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. Eleanor paused, about to close the door again, when a fragment of their whispered words reached her.
"His Grace was most particular about it,"
one maid was saying. "Told Mr. Grant himself that he wanted the woman from the garden path brought here, no other." "The garden path," the second maid repeated. "Not the ballroom?" "That's what I heard. Something happened out in the garden that night, something His Grace has never spoken of to a soul. But Mr. Grant says he has not been the same since. Said he'd know her the moment he saw her again." Eleanor's blood went cold. The garden path, not the ballroom. Whatever had happened between the Duke and the woman he sought, it had not taken place beneath the chandeliers where Charlotte had spent her evening dancing and laughing with a dozen admiring young men. It had happened somewhere quieter, somewhere private, between the Duke and a woman he had not forgotten. Which meant the story her family had told her, the neat little tale of a Duke enchanted by a beauty across a crowded ballroom, was not the truth at all. Something else had happened that night. Someone else had been in that garden, and Eleanor had no way of knowing who that someone truly was, or what they had said to a man who now looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking for months. She closed the door softly and leaned against it, her heart racing with a fear sharper than any she had felt yet. Whatever secret waited behind the Duke's careful gaze, she understood now that discovering it would decide everything, for the man who had welcomed her so warmly tonight was not chasing the story she had been given. He was chasing a memory, a real one, and sooner or later, Eleanor knew, that memory would demand a name she could not honestly give. She had come to Ashworth Hall wearing a borrowed identity for a matter of weeks, expecting boredom and dismissal to end the arrangement quietly. Instead, she had stepped into the middle of a mystery that belonged to someone else entirely, one she now had no choice but to navigate alone, veiled, frightened, and entirely unprepared for a Duke who remembered far more than anyone in her family had ever imagined. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor lay awake long after the candles had burned low, listening to the wind move through the old trees outside her window, turning the maid's words over and over in her mind until they lost all shape and became only a single, unshakable thought. Someone had met the Duke in that garden. Someone had said something to him that he had carried with him for months, unspoken and unforgotten. And whoever that woman truly was, Eleanor now stood in her place, wearing her veil, answering to her name, with no memory of the moment that had changed a Duke's life forever. She thought of writing to her aunt in the morning, demanding to know the full truth of what had happened that night, but she knew already what answer she would receive. Silence, or worse, a sharp reminder that her only task was to keep the secret and wait for the arrangement to end quietly on its own. No one in her family had thought to ask what had truly drawn the Duke's attention. They had simply assumed, as everyone always assumed, that beauty alone had done the work, and that any clever young woman could fill in the rest. But Eleanor was beginning to understand that the Duke was not a man easily fooled by appearances. He watched too closely. He remembered too much. And somewhere beneath the careful manners and quiet warmth he had shown her that evening, there was a question waiting to be asked, one she feared she would not be able to answer when it finally came. A carriage arrived at Ashworth Hall before noon, and Eleanor's stomach turned the moment she heard the wheels on the gravel drive, certain for one terrible instant that her family had come to drag her home in shame before she had even learned what secret she was hiding from. It was not her family. It was a distant relation of the Duke's, an older woman named Aunt Beatrice Colton, arriving for an unannounced visit that threw the household into a quiet flurry of preparation. Eleanor watched from her window as the woman stepped down from the carriage, sharp-eyed and elegant, the kind of relative who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and she felt the small comfort she had built over the past days begin to crumble. She had not expected visitors. She had not prepared for anyone beyond the Duke himself, and the thought of a stranger studying her closely, searching for the smallest crack in her story, made her hands tremble as she dressed for the midday meal. The Duke found her in the hallway before she reached the dining room, and something in his expression eased the tightness in her chest, if only slightly. He looked pleased to see her, the same warmth from the night before still present in his eyes, and for a moment Eleanor allowed herself to forget the danger waiting downstairs. "My aunt arrives without warning as a matter of habit," he said, offering his arm. "I apologize in advance. She asks a great many questions, and she rarely accepts vague answers." "I shall do my best," Eleanor said, though her voice betrayed none of the fear sitting heavy in her chest. The meal began pleasantly enough. Aunt Beatrice spoke at length about the state of the roads and the foolishness of her coachman, and Eleanor allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of polite, meaningless conversation. But halfway through the second course, the older woman turned her sharp gaze toward Eleanor and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You have the Whitfield look about you," she said, "though not quite what I remember from the portrait Julian showed me. Something about the eyes is different." Eleanor's heart stopped. "I believe portraits rarely capture a person accurately, ma'am." "Perhaps," Aunt Beatrice said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. "Tell me, dear, how do you find the gardens here? Julian tells me you have a particular fondness for them." The question landed like a blow, and Eleanor understood at once that it was not an idle one. The garden. The place where something had happened between the Duke and the true woman behind the veil, something Eleanor knew nothing about. She glanced toward the Duke, who was watching her with quiet interest, waiting for her answer as though it mattered a great deal. "The gardens are lovely," Eleanor said carefully, choosing each word as though walking across thin ice. "Though I confess I have not yet had the chance to explore them fully since my arrival." A small silence followed, and Eleanor feared she had said something wrong, some detail that contradicted whatever the Duke believed he knew about her. But then Aunt Beatrice smiled, satisfied, and moved on to a story about a mutual acquaintance's disastrous garden party, and the moment passed without further scrutiny. Eleanor did not breathe easily again until the meal ended, and Aunt Beatrice retired to rest before the evening's entertainment. She excused herself as quickly as manners allowed and made her way outside into the fresh air, desperate for a moment alone to steady her nerves. She found the garden path easily enough, a winding trail of white stone bordered by roses just beginning to bloom, leading toward a small stone bench beneath an old oak tree. She sat there for a long while, trying to imagine what had happened in a place like this, what words had passed between the Duke and a stranger that had left such a lasting mark on him. "I thought I might find you here." Eleanor turned, startled, to find the Duke approaching along the path, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful. "Forgive me for intruding on your solitude," he said, taking a seat beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but far enough to remain proper. "I find myself drawn to this particular spot more often than I care to admit. Is there a reason for that, Your Grace?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the roses rather than at her. "There is," he said finally, "though I find I am not yet ready to speak of it fully. I hope you will forgive my reluctance." Eleanor studied his profile, the tension in his jaw, the careful way he chose his words, and she understood that whatever had happened in this garden weighed on him deeply. far more than a simple conversation at a masquerade would explain. "I would never press you for something you are not ready to share," she said, and she meant it, though guilt twisted in her chest at the irony of her own words. She was pressing him for information constantly, desperately, though never aloud. He turned to look at her then, and something in his gaze softened. "You have a way of putting a person at ease," he said. "I noticed it the very first time we spoke. It is a rare quality, and I confess it is one of the reasons I asked for you to be sent here, above all others." Eleanor's breath caught. "Above all others, Your Grace?" "I had offers," he admitted, a faint smile touching his lips. "Families eager to align themselves with a duke will send daughters forward regardless of whether their heart is asked. But I wanted only you. I have wanted only you since that night." The words settled over Eleanor like a weight she was not prepared to carry. He believed he wanted her, but he did not know her, not truly. He wanted a woman who had stood with him in this garden and said things Eleanor had never spoken, who had left an impression so deep that he had built months of longing around it. Eleanor was merely wearing that woman's shape, and the thought of him discovering the difference terrified her more with every passing hour. "Your Grace," she began, hesitant, "may I ask what it was that made such an impression on you that night?" "I confess I would like to understand it better myself." It was a risk, asking such a direct question, but she needed some thread to follow, some fragment of truth she could use to protect herself from a misstep that might expose everything. He considered her for a long moment before answering. "You spoke to me as though my title meant nothing to you," he said quietly, "as though I were simply a man standing in a garden, and not a duke worth pursuing for his fortune. No one has ever spoken to me that way before. Every young woman I meet weighs my worth before she weighs my character, and I have grown so accustomed to it that I no longer expect anything different. But you looked at me and asked what kind of man I wished to be, not what kind of husband I would make. I have not been able to forget it." Eleanor's chest ached with the weight of those words, because she understood now, with painful clarity, that whoever had spoken to the Duke in this garden had given him something honest and rare, a moment untouched by ambition or greed. And Eleanor, despite the lies she carried, found herself wanting desperately to be worthy of the feeling those words had left behind, even if she had not been the one to plant them. "I am glad it meant something to you," she said softly, and it was the truest thing she had said to him since her arrival. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, until the evening chill began to settle over the garden and the Duke rose, offering his hand to help her from the bench. As they walked back toward the house, he paused near the entrance and turned to face her. "There will be a small dinner tomorrow evening," he said. "Aunt Beatrice has invited a few of her acquaintances from the county. I hope you will not find it too tiresome." Eleanor forced a smile, though dread was already creeping back into her chest. A dinner meant more strangers, more questions, more opportunities for the truth to slip through the careful walls she had built around herself. "I look forward to it," she lied. That night, sleep came in fits and starts, broken by dreams of gardens and vales and a name she could not remember, one that belonged to a stranger whose place she had taken, without ever meaning to fall as deeply as she already had. The following evening arrived faster than Eleanor would have liked. The dining room glittered with candlelight, and a dozen guests filled the long table, their conversation bright and constant, weaving through topics Eleanor struggled to follow with her mind so thoroughly occupied by fear. She kept close to the Duke's side whenever manners allowed, grateful for the small protection his presence offered against the sharper questions of the other guests. It was during the second course that disaster nearly found her. A woman seated across the table, a cousin of Aunt Beatrice's by marriage, leaned forward with sudden interest and addressed Eleanor directly. "I believe we have met before," the woman said, studying her closely. "At the Ashford wedding, was it not? You were seated with the Whitfield party, I recall, though I confess the young lady I remember had a rather different manner about her." Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears. The Ashford wedding. She had never attended such an event. Charlotte had, certainly, along with half the county, but Eleanor had remained home as she always did, invisible and unnecessary to any gathering that mattered. "I fear you may be thinking of my cousin," Eleanor said carefully, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We are often mistaken for one another, though I assure you our temperaments differ a great deal." The woman frowned slightly, clearly unconvinced, and opened her mouth to press further. But before she could speak, the Duke's voice cut smoothly across the table, drawing attention away with practiced ease. "I find family resemblances endlessly confusing myself," he said, smiling warmly at Eleanor, in a way that suggested he had noticed her distress, and moved deliberately to shield her from it. "My own cousins are nearly impossible to tell apart at a distance." The conversation shifted, the moment passed, and Eleanor released a shaking breath beneath the cover of the table's noise. She caught the Duke's eye across the candlelight, and he offered her the smallest, most private smile, one that told her he had seen her fear and chosen, without hesitation, to protect her from it. But as the dinner continued and the danger of the evening slowly faded, Eleanor could not shake the growing weight settling over her heart. The Duke had defended her without knowing why she needed defending. He had shielded a lie without understanding it was a lie at all. And the longer she remained in this house, wearing a name that was not hers, accepting a kindness that belonged to a stranger, the more Eleanor understood that every day she stayed made the coming reckoning more painful, both for herself and for a man who deserved far better than the deception she had been forced to carry into his home. When the guests finally departed and the house grew quiet again, Eleanor lingered in the hallway rather than retreating immediately to her chamber. She was too unsettled for sleep, her thoughts tangled between gratitude for the Duke's protection and shame at how easily she had let him defend a lie he did not know he was defending. She found herself drawn toward the library, where a single lamp still burned, and she was not entirely surprised to find the Duke there, seated near the fire with a glass of wine untouched at his elbow. "I hope I am not disturbing you," she said from the doorway. "Never," he said, rising at once and gesturing toward the chair opposite his own. "I find I sleep poorly after evenings such as this. Too many voices, too little quiet." Eleanor sat, grateful for the warmth of the fire and the stillness of the room after the noise of the dinner. "Thank you," she said after a moment, "for what you did at the table. I did not expect you to notice." "I notice a great deal more than people assume," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "You looked as though the ground had opened beneath you. I could not simply watch and do nothing." Eleanor lowered her gaze to her hands, folded tightly in her lap. "I fear I am not always as composed as I would like to appear." "None of us are," he said gently. "I have spent years learning to appear unshaken, in rooms full of people who wish to see me stumble. It is exhausting, pretending at ease when the truth is something far more uncertain." She glanced up at him, struck by the honesty in his voice, and for a moment she forgot the danger of her situation entirely, caught instead in the simple comfort of speaking with someone who seemed, despite everything, to truly see her. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" "Julian," he corrected softly. "And yes, of course. Why does it matter so much to you, the way a person treats your title rather than your character? Surely most men in your position would not think twice about it." He considered the question for a long moment, turning his untouched glass slowly in his hand. "Because I was deceived once," he said finally, "by a woman who wanted the title far more than she wanted me. I did not see it until it was nearly too late, and the discovery cost me a great deal, not only in trust, but in my belief that such honesty as I found in the garden that night could exist at all. When I met you, I felt for the first time in years that perhaps I had been wrong to give up hope." Eleanor's chest tightened with guilt so sharp it nearly stole her breath. She wanted, more than anything, to tell him the truth in that moment, to confess the lie she carried and beg his understanding. But the fear of his anger, and the fear of what would happen to her once the truth was known, held her tongue in place, and she said nothing at all, only nodded and let the silence stretch between them until it grew heavy with everything neither of them dared to say. "It grows late," she said finally, rising from her chair. "I should retire." He rose as well, walking her to the door of the library, and for a brief moment his hand rested near hers, not quite touching, though the warmth of it lingered long after she had climbed the stairs and closed the door of her chamber behind her. She sat awake long into the night, turning his words over in her mind, understanding now with painful clarity that the deception she carried was no longer a simple matter of a family's convenience. It had become something far more dangerous, a lie sitting at the center of a man's rebuilt trust, and Eleanor feared that when it finally broke, as she now knew it must, it would break him as much as it broke her. The letter arrived with the morning post, and Eleanor knew from the handwriting alone, sharp and slanted and unmistakably her aunt's, that whatever waited inside would shatter the fragile peace she had built over the past week at Ashworth Hall. She carried it to her chamber before opening it, her hands trembling as she broke the seal, and read the words twice to be certain she had understood them correctly. Her aunt's tone was brisk and impatient, entirely devoid of gratitude for the risk Eleanor had taken on the family's behalf. Charlotte's Viscount had proposed. The wedding was to be arranged for early autumn, and it would not do, her aunt wrote, for whispers to circulate about another Whitfield daughter entangled with a duke while Charlotte prepared to marry elsewhere. Eleanor was instructed to end the arrangement at Ashworth Hall within a fortnight, by whatever means necessary, and return home quietly before questions could be raised. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after reading the letter, staring at the wall without truly seeing it. A fortnight. She had known from the beginning that this arrangement was never meant to last, that she was only ever a placeholder, a convenient body to occupy a courtship until the family's real plans could proceed undisturbed. But somewhere in the quiet evenings in the library, in the conversations by the garden path, she had allowed herself to forget that truth, and the reminder now struck her with a force she had not expected. She thought of the Duke's face the night before, lit by firelight as he spoke of trust rebuilt and hope restored, and something in her chest twisted painfully at the thought of ending it all within a fortnight, by whatever means necessary, as though he were an obligation to be managed rather than a man whose feelings mattered. She did not go down to breakfast that morning. She could not trust her face to hide the turmoil rioting beneath her calm expression, and she feared that one look from the Duke would undo every careful wall she had built. Instead, she remained in her chamber, staring at the letter until the words blurred together, until a soft knock came at her door, and Mrs. Pruitt entered with a tray of tea and a gentle, knowing look that suggested the older woman had noticed far more than Eleanor realized. "His Grace asked after you," Mrs. Pruitt said, setting the tray down carefully. "He seemed concerned when you did not come down." "I am simply tired," Eleanor said, though the excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. Mrs. Pruitt studied her for a moment, then reached out and gave her hand a brief motherly squeeze. "Whatever burden you are carrying, child, know that this house has seen its share of secrets before. Sometimes the truth, however frightening, is a kinder path than the one paved with silence." Eleanor said nothing, but the words lodged themselves deep in her chest, refusing to be dislodged for the rest of the day. She finally emerged from her chamber in the late afternoon, drawn outside by a restlessness she could not contain within four walls any longer. She found the Duke in the stables, tending to one of his horses with the sleeves of his shirt rolled to his elbows, a sight so unexpectedly ordinary that it caught her off guard. He looked up when he heard her approach, and concern immediately softened the intensity of his expression. "I worried something had happened," he said, setting aside the brush he had been using and crossing the stable toward her. "You seemed unwell this morning." "I received a letter from my family," she said, which was true enough, even if it was far from the whole truth. "Troubling news, I take it." Eleanor hesitated, torn between the safety of silence and the growing, desperate urge to tell him something real, even if it could not yet be everything. "My cousin is to be married in the autumn," she said finally. "The news simply reminded me how quickly things can change, and how little control any of us truly have over our own lives." The Duke studied her closely, and for a moment, Eleanor feared he had heard something beneath her words, some fracture in the careful story she had maintained since her arrival. But he only nodded, understanding in his eyes, and gestured toward a bench near the stable doors where they could sit together in the fading afternoon light. "I understand that feeling more than you might expect," he said once they were seated. "For years, I felt as though my own life belonged to everyone but myself. My title demanded certain choices, certain marriages, certain alliances, all decided by men who cared nothing for what I actually wanted. It nearly broke something in me, before I found the strength to demand a different path." "How did you find that strength?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious despite the danger simmering beneath the conversation. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with visible care. "I told you once that a woman deceived me," he said. "What I did not tell you was how deeply that deception cut. Not because I loved her, for I did not, but because it confirmed every fear I carried about the kind of life waiting for me, a life built on ambition rather than honesty. After she was exposed, I made a vow to myself that I would never again enter a courtship without first testing the honesty of the woman before me, before I ever offered my heart." Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. "Testing her honesty," she repeated slowly. "How does one test such a thing?" "The veil," he said simply. "I ask that you keep it, not merely out of romantic sentiment, but because I wanted to know whether a woman could care for the man beneath the title, without the distraction of appearance, without knowing whether I was handsome enough or wealthy enough to be worth the effort of honesty. I wanted to see character revealed slowly, truthfully, without the shortcuts appearance allows." Eleanor's mouth went dry. The veil was not simply tradition or eccentricity. It was a deliberate test, designed to strip away every advantage a woman like Charlotte might have relied upon, every charm built on beauty rather than substance. And Eleanor, wearing that veil under false pretenses, had been failing that test from the very first moment she arrived, not through dishonesty of feeling, but through the fundamental lie of her presence itself. "And have I passed your test, Your Grace?" she asked quietly, though she dreaded the answer as much as she needed to hear it. He turned to look at her fully, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Every day," he said, "you have shown me kindness without calculation, curiosity without agenda, and honesty in every conversation we have shared, save for the moments you seem determined to hide something you are afraid to tell me." Eleanor's breath caught sharply. "What makes you say that?" "I have watched you carefully since your arrival," he said. "There are moments when a shadow crosses your face, when you choose your words as though navigating a narrow bridge over dangerous water. I do not know what burden you carry, but I know it weighs on you heavily, and I would rather you trust me with it than continue to carry it alone." The words hung in the air between them, an invitation Eleanor desperately wanted to accept. She opened her mouth, the truth rising in her throat, ready at last to spill free after days of careful containment. But the memory of her aunt's letter surfaced suddenly in her mind, the cold instruction to end things quietly, the reminder of what exposure would cost not only herself but her entire family, and the words died before she could speak them. "I fear it is not yet time," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I promise you, when I am ready, you will be the first to know the truth." Disappointment flickered across his face, quickly hidden behind understanding patience. "Then I shall wait," he said, "for as long as you need." They sat together in silence, as the sun began to lower over the stable roof, and Eleanor found herself grateful, achingly so, for a man willing to offer patience rather than demand answers she was not yet brave enough to give. But gratitude did little to ease the weight settling deeper into her chest with every passing hour. The growing certainty that the fortnight her aunt had demanded would not be nearly enough time to untangle herself from a lie that had already grown roots far deeper than she ever intended. That evening, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Eleanor wandered down to the garden alone, drawn by some instinct she could not fully explain toward the path where the Duke's mysterious memory had first taken root. The moon hung low and full above the trees, casting silver light across the roses, and Eleanor walked slowly along the stone path, trying to imagine the woman who had once stood here and spoken words honest enough to change a duke's entire understanding of trust. She paused near the old oak tree, the same spot where she and the duke had sat together days before, and allowed herself, for the first time since her arrival, to weep quietly for the impossibility of her situation. She had not asked for this deception. She had not chosen to step into a stranger's shoes and inherit a stranger's unfinished story. And yet here she stood, falling for a man who believed her to be someone else entirely, trapped between her family's cold instructions and a growing tenderness in her own heart that she had never expected and could not now deny. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and Eleanor turned sharply, half expecting to find the Duke standing there, having followed her into the moonlit garden. Instead, she found no one, only the quiet rustle of wind moving through the roses, though the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered long after she convinced herself she had imagined the sound. She made her way back toward the house slowly, her thoughts heavy with everything she had learned that day. The veil was a test of honesty, and Eleanor had built her entire presence at Ashworth Hall upon the deepest dishonesty imaginable. The Duke had trusted her with the truth of his own wounded heart, and she had repaid that trust with careful silence and half-formed evasions. And somewhere beyond the walls of this house, her family waited with cold instructions to end everything quietly, as though the growing bond between herself and the Duke were nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed rather than something real, something worth protecting. By the time she reached her chamber and closed the door behind her, Eleanor had come to a quiet, frightening resolution. She could not continue this deception indefinitely, not without destroying whatever fragile trust had grown between herself and the Duke, and not without losing entirely the parts of herself she valued most. The truth would have to come out eventually, whether by her own confession or by discovery she could not control. The following morning, she resolved to speak with Mrs. Pruitt, hoping the older woman's earlier words meant she might offer some guidance, some way forward that did not end in complete ruin. She found the housekeeper in the small sitting room off the kitchen, folding linens with practiced efficiency, and Eleanor lingered in the doorway until Mrs. Pruitt glanced up and set her work aside. "You look as though you have not slept," Mrs. Pruitt said gently, gesturing for Eleanor to sit. "I have not," Eleanor admitted, lowering herself into the chair across from the housekeeper. "You said yesterday that this house has seen its share of secrets. I wonder if you might tell me what became of them." Mrs. Pruitt studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. "Secrets kept out of fear rarely end well, child, but secrets kept out of love, spoken honestly before pride or shame can twist them further. Those have a way of finding forgiveness, even when the truth is difficult to hear. His Grace is not a cruel man. Whatever burden you carry, I do not believe he is the sort to turn away from honesty, however painful. And if the truth changes everything he believes about me, then perhaps, Mrs. Pruitt said carefully, what changes is not his feeling for you, but simply his understanding of how that feeling came to be. A man does not stop loving a garden because he learns the seeds were planted differently than he first believed. Eleanor turned the words over in her mind for the rest of the day, finding neither full comfort nor complete resolve in them, only a fragile thread of hope she was not yet brave enough to fully grasp. That afternoon the Duke sought her out again, finding her in the drawing room where she had retreated with a book she had not managed to read a single page of. He carried with him an air of quiet purpose, and Eleanor's pulse quickened, fearing he had finally decided to press her for the truth she had promised to eventually share. "I have sent word to an old acquaintance in London," he said instead, settling into the chair across from her. "A man who was present at the Ashford masquerade, and might recall more of that evening than I do myself. I find my memory of certain details has grown less certain with time, and I confess I would like to understand more clearly what truly happened that night." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. "Why now, Your Grace?" "Because something about the account does not sit as comfortably as it once did," he admitted, his gaze steady on hers. "Small details that do not align quite as they should. I do not say this to accuse you of anything. I say it only because I wish to understand fully, before I allow myself to fall any further than I already have." The words struck Eleanor like a blow, gentle in delivery but devastating in implication. He was already searching for the truth on his own, quietly, carefully, in a manner that suggested he suspected far more than he had yet spoken aloud. Eleanor forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her expression composed, though panic clawed at the edges of her calm. "I hope your acquaintance can offer the clarity you seek," she said. And though the words were true enough on their surface, they concealed a terror she dared not show. He reached across the small distance between their chairs, and took her hand gently in his own, a touch so unexpected and so tender that Eleanor's breath caught entirely. "Whatever I learn," he said quietly, "I want you to know that my feelings for the woman sitting before me now are not so easily undone by facts alone. I have come to know you these past days, Eleanor, not merely the memory of a masquerade, but you, in this house, in this garden, in every quiet conversation we have shared. That knowledge means more to me than I think you realize." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she could not fully explain, torn between the joy of hearing her true name spoken with such warmth, and the crushing guilt of everything still left unsaid. She squeezed his hand gently in return, unable to trust her voice with words in that moment, and they sat together in silence as the afternoon light slowly faded toward evening, both of them aware, in their own separate ways, that the careful piece holding their fragile arrangement together was rapidly beginning to unravel. The carriage that arrived at Ashworth Hall 3 days later brought with it the one person Eleanor feared above all others, and the moment she saw Charlotte Whitfield step down onto the gravel drive, dressed in traveling silk and wearing an expression of cold determination, Eleanor understood that whatever peace remained in her borrowed life was about to end. She watched from an upstairs window, frozen in place, as Charlotte swept toward the entrance with the confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her welcome anywhere. Eleanor's first instinct was to flee, to hide in her chamber and pray the confrontation might somehow pass her by, but she knew such cowardice would only delay the inevitable, and perhaps make everything worse when it finally arrived. She met Charlotte in the hallway outside the drawing room, where a footman had directed the unexpected guest to wait while the Duke was informed of her arrival. Charlotte's eyes swept over Eleanor's simple gown, her expression curling into something between amusement and disdain. "You look almost comfortable here," Charlotte said quietly, her voice pitched low enough to avoid the servants nearby. "I confess I did not expect you to still be playing this game so many weeks later. Mother said you would tire of it within a fortnight. What are you doing here, Charlotte?" Eleanor asked, keeping her own voice equally low, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Checking on the family's investment," Charlotte said with a small, careless shrug. "Mother received word that His Grace has grown rather attached to you, or rather, to the woman he believes you to be. That was never part of the arrangement. You were meant to bore him, not enchant him. I have done nothing but survive each day as carefully as I know how," Eleanor said, anger creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to remain calm. "I did not ask for any of this." Charlotte's expression shifted, something calculating entering her gaze. "Perhaps not," she said slowly, "but it seems fortune has handed you an opportunity all the same. A duke, genuinely taken with the woman he believes you to be. Tell me, cousin, has he mentioned marriage yet?" Eleanor's stomach twisted. That is none of your concern. On the contrary, Charlotte said, stepping closer, her voice sharpening. It is entirely my concern. My Viscount's family has grown cautious these past weeks, whispers reaching them about a Whitfield daughter entangled with a duke, while I am promised elsewhere. It raises questions about our family's honesty, questions I do not intend to let ruin my own engagement. I have decided to end this charade myself, properly, as it should have been done from the beginning. Eleanor's blood ran cold. What do you mean to do? I mean to tell him the truth, Charlotte said simply, that I am the woman he truly seeks, and that you were only ever meant to occupy his time until I was ready to claim my place. Once he understands the confusion, I am certain a man so evidently taken with a Whitfield woman will transfer his affection easily enough. Beauty tends to make such transitions simple. Before Eleanor could respond, the drawing room doors opened, and the Duke emerged, his expression polite but faintly puzzled as he took in the sight of two women who so clearly shared a family resemblance, standing together in his hallway. Forgive me, he said, glancing between them. I was not informed we were expecting a second guest. Your Grace, Charlotte said smoothly, sweeping into a graceful curtsy that Eleanor's own nerves would never have allowed. I am Charlotte Whitfield. I believe there has been a rather significant misunderstanding regarding our family's arrangement with you, one I felt compelled to correct in person. The Duke's gaze shifted to Eleanor, confusion deepening into something more guarded. I am afraid I do not follow. Charlotte did not hesitate. I am the woman you met at the Ashford masquerade, Your Grace. The veil, the garden, the conversation you have spoken of so fondly. That was myself, not my cousin. There was a mistake in the arrangements, a foolish one on my family's part, and Eleanor was sent here in my place due to unfortunate circumstances I would rather not detail. I have come now to set things right. The silence that followed felt endless to Eleanor, who stood frozen, watching the Duke's expression shift through confusion, disbelief, and something colder still as he processed Charlotte's words. He turned to look at Eleanor directly, and the hurt flickering behind his eyes struck her harder than any anger could have. Is this true? He asked quietly, and the careful control in his voice frightened her more than shouting ever could have. Eleanor's throat closed around the words she needed to speak. Every instinct urged her to deny it, to protect herself, to let Charlotte's confident lie stand unchallenged and hide behind it as she had hidden behind so much else these past weeks. But looking into the Duke's face, seeing the wounded confusion there, Eleanor understood that she could not, would not, let another lie stand between them, not after everything they had shared. Not entirely, Eleanor said, her voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. I was sent here in Charlotte's place, that much is true. My family believed you had chosen her at the masquerade, and when she refused to come, I was sent instead, wearing her name and her veil. But Your Grace, I do not believe Charlotte was the woman who spoke to you in that garden. I do not know who that woman truly was, but I have come to know you these past weeks as myself, not as anyone else's shadow, and everything I have felt in that time has been entirely my own. Charlotte's composure cracked, fury flashing across her face. How dare you contradict me in front of His Grace? You forget your place, cousin. I have spent my entire life remembering my place, Eleanor said, turning to face her cousin fully for the first time, years of quiet resentment finally finding a voice. I am done pretending it is smaller than it truly is. The Duke stood silent through the exchange, his gaze moving between the two women with an intensity that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Finally he spoke, his voice carefully measured. I believe I require some time alone to consider what has been said here today. Charlotte, I thank you for traveling all this way, though I confess your revelation raises far more questions than it answers. Mrs. Pruitt will see you to a guest chamber for the evening while matters are sorted appropriately. Charlotte's mouth opened as though to protest, but something in the Duke's expression silenced her, and she allowed herself to be led away by the housekeeper, casting one final, venomous glance toward Eleanor, before disappearing down the corridor. Eleanor remained standing in the hallway, alone with the Duke, the weight of everything finally spoken settling heavily over both of them. She waited, breathless, for him to speak, to condemn her, to send her away in disgrace as she had always feared he might. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking in a voice quieter than she had ever heard from him. I need time, Eleanor, not to decide whether I still care for you, for I fear that decision was made weeks ago and is not so easily undone, but to understand fully what has happened here and what it means for whatever comes next between us. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the hallway, uncertain whether the ground beneath her had just shifted toward ruin or towards something she had not yet allowed herself to hope for. She retreated to her chamber and sat by the window long into the evening, watching the light fade slowly over the gardens below, replaying every word of the confrontation until it blurred together into a single unbearable knot of fear and relief. Relief that the truth, or at least a portion of it, had finally been spoken aloud after weeks of careful concealment. Fear that speaking it had cost her the one thing she had come to treasure most in this unfamiliar house, the quiet, growing warmth of a man who had trusted her with pieces of himself he had shared with no one else. A soft knock came at her door sometime after the dinner hour, and Eleanor opened it to find Mrs. Pruitt standing in the corridor, a tray of tea balanced carefully in her hands, though her eyes carried more concern than the simple errand explained. "I thought you might need something warm," the housekeeper said, setting the tray down on the small table near the window. "Word travels quickly in a house this size, child, and I confess I have heard enough of it to understand you are carrying a heavier burden than most guests who pass through these halls." Eleanor sank into the chair beside the table, suddenly exhausted in a way that reached far deeper than her body. "I told him the truth," she said quietly, "or enough of it to matter. I do not know if it was the right choice." "Truth is rarely a choice with a right or wrong answer," Mrs. Pruitt said, pouring the tea with steady, practiced hands. "It simply is, and what remains afterward depends on the character of the people left standing in its wake. His Grace is not a man who abandons what he values simply because it arrived to him imperfectly." "How can you be so certain?" Mrs. Pruitt paused, setting the teapot down gently. "Because I have served this family for over 20 years, child, and I watched what that first deception did to him, the one before your arrival. He withdrew from nearly everyone for the better part of a year. Yet in these past weeks I have watched him laugh again, watched him seek out company rather than avoid it, watched the shadows lift from a face that had grown far too accustomed to carrying them alone. Whatever confusion tonight has caused, I do not believe it will erase the good that has already taken root." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for the small comfort of it, though sleep still felt impossibly distant. And if Charlotte convinces him that her claim is the true one, she has beauty and confidence I have never possessed, and a story that fits far more neatly than mine. "A story that fits neatly is not the same as a story that is true," Mrs. Pruitt said firmly. "His Grace is a careful man. He will not be swayed by confidence alone, not after everything he has already confided in you these past weeks. Trust him to see clearly, even if the path to that clarity feels uncertain tonight." Eleanor thanked her for the comfort, though doubt still lingered heavily in her chest long after Mrs. Pruitt had gone, taking the empty tray with her and leaving Eleanor alone once more with her thoughts. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and restless, filled with fragmented dreams of gardens and vales and Charlotte's triumphant smile stretching wider with every passing moment. Eleanor woke before dawn, her chamber still dark, and lay staring at the ceiling until the first gray light of morning crept through the curtains, marking the beginning of a day she dreaded more than any that had come before it. She dressed carefully, choosing her plainest gown, some small part of her deciding that if this was to be the day her fate was finally decided, she would face it honestly, without artifice or pretense, exactly as herself. She made her way down to the breakfast room early, hoping for a few quiet moments to steady her nerves before either the Duke or Charlotte appeared, but she found Charlotte already seated at the table, sipping tea with an air of satisfied calm that set Eleanor's teeth on edge immediately. "You look as though you slept poorly," Charlotte observed, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in her voice. "I, on the other hand, slept remarkably well. I find clarity has a way of settling the nerves. What have you done, Charlotte?" "Nothing yet," Charlotte said, setting down her cup with deliberate precision, "though I intend to speak with His Grace again this morning, privately, and remind him of certain practical realities your little confession last night conveniently overlooked. Whatever fondness he has developed for you, Eleanor, you have neither the fortune nor the connections to make a suitable duchess. I, however, have both, along with the very story he has spent months longing to hear confirmed. Sentiment rarely wins against practicality in matters such as these, however much either of us might wish otherwise." Eleanor said nothing, though her hands trembled slightly as she took her own seat at the table, dread pooling heavy in her stomach at the thought of whatever confrontation the morning still held in store for all of them. The breakfast room fell into complete silence the moment Charlotte rose from her chair and declared, loudly enough for every servant in earshot to hear, that a grave injustice was about to be corrected before the entire household. Eleanor had not expected the confrontation to happen so publicly. She had assumed Charlotte would seek a private audience with the Duke, as she had claimed over breakfast, But instead, her cousin seemed to have decided that a larger stage suited her purposes better, and when the Duke entered the breakfast room moments later, drawn by the commotion, he found himself facing not a quiet conversation, but a full and deliberate performance. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, sweeping into a curtsy so graceful it might have belonged on a London stage. "I apologize for the disruption, but I could not allow another moment to pass with this misunderstanding uncorrected. I am the woman you met in the garden that night. Whatever affection you have developed for my cousin these past weeks was built upon a foundation that was never truly hers to claim." The Duke's expression remained carefully composed, though Eleanor, watching closely from across the room, could see the tension gathering in the set of his jaw. "You have made this claim before," he said evenly. "I confess I remain unconvinced." "Then allow me to convince you," Charlotte said, undeterred, stepping closer. "Ask me anything of that evening, Your Grace. The color of the ribbons in my hair, the song playing as we spoke, the exact words you used when you asked my name and I refused to give it. I remember every detail, because that night mattered to me as much as it clearly mattered to you." A murmur rippled through the small gathering of servants who had paused their morning duties to witness the unfolding drama, and Eleanor felt her heart sink with each confident word Charlotte spoke. Her cousin had always possessed a talent for performance, for making even a lie sound polished and certain, and Eleanor feared that against such practiced confidence, her own quieter honesty would never be enough to prevail. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying Charlotte with an expression Eleanor could not read. "Very well," he said finally. "The ribbons in your hair that night, if you truly recall them, what color were they?" Charlotte hesitated only a fraction of a second, though Eleanor caught it, the smallest flicker of uncertainty before her cousin answered. "Blue," she said. "A deep, rich blue, to match my gown." The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "Interesting," he said quietly. "I do not recall the color of any ribbons at all, because the woman I spoke with that night wore no ribbons in her hair. She wore it simply, without ornament, which I remember distinctly because it struck me as unusual among so many elaborately dressed guests." Charlotte's composure faltered visibly for the first time since her arrival. "Perhaps my memory of such a small detail has simply faded with time," she said, though the confidence in her voice had thinned considerably. "Perhaps," the Duke agreed, though his tone made clear he did not believe it. "Or perhaps, Charlotte, you were never in that garden at all." The room fell utterly silent. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she feared everyone present could hear it, and she watched, breathless, as the Duke turned away from Charlotte entirely and faced the room at large, his gaze sweeping over the gathered servants before settling, finally, on Eleanor herself. "I have known the truth for several days now," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "The acquaintance I wrote to in London responded promptly, and his account of that evening confirmed what I had already begun to suspect on my own. The woman in the garden that night did not attend as a guest at all. She had come as a companion to an elderly relation, seated near the garden doors because the crowded ballroom had grown too warm for the older woman's comfort. She stepped outside for air and found herself, quite by accident, in conversation with a Duke who had also grown tired of the noise and false pleasantries within." Eleanor's breath caught entirely. She had not known this detail, had never imagined the true circumstances behind the encounter that had shaped so much of what followed, and she listened now with the same rapt attention as everyone else in the room. "I did not learn her name that night," the Duke continued. "She left before I could ask it properly, called away by her duties, and I spent months afterward searching for any trace of her, certain I would recognize her the moment I saw her again, veil or no veil. When word reached me of a Whitfield daughter who had been present at the same masquerade, I assumed, wrongly, that fortune had finally granted me an easy path back to her. I sent for that daughter, believing the arrangement would reunite me with the woman from the garden." He paused, and his gaze softened as it rested fully on Eleanor, standing frozen and disbelieving near the window. "But the woman who arrived at my door was not the woman from that ballroom crowd, nor the confident beauty who now stands before me making bold claims she cannot support. She arrived frightened, uncertain, wearing a name that was not her own, and yet within days, she showed me more honesty, more genuine character, than any woman I have met in years, myself included, who so carefully performed the role assigned to her by circumstance." Charlotte's face had drained of all color. Her earlier confidence collapsed entirely under the weight of the Duke's steady, unwavering account. "Your Grace, I am not finished," the Duke said, and though his voice remained calm, there was steel beneath it now that silenced Charlotte immediately. "I have made inquiries these past days, quietly, through my solicitor, into the exact nature of the arrangement between my household and the Whitfield family. I know now that Eleanor was sent here against her own wishes, substituted for a cousin who refused the arrangement outright, with strict instructions to end things quietly, the moment the family's true intentions required it. I know that a letter arrived recently demanding exactly that outcome within a fortnight. Eleanor's stomach dropped. He knew everything, had known for days apparently, and had said nothing, had continued their quiet conversations and shared moments with a knowledge she had not suspected him to possess. "You knew," she said softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "You knew, and you said nothing." "I wanted to give you the chance to tell me yourself," he said, turning fully toward her now, his expression gentling considerably. "I understood, better than perhaps I let on, the impossible position your family placed you in. I did not wish to force a confession before you were ready to give it freely, and when you spoke the truth yesterday, incomplete though it was, I understood, it cost you a great deal of courage to say even that much." Charlotte, recovering some measure of her composure, attempted one final gambit. "Your Grace, surely you cannot mean to choose a woman with no fortune, no true connection to this family's arrangement, over a match that would benefit both our houses properly. Whatever affection has grown between you, practicality must eventually—" "Practicality," the Duke interrupted, "has never once produced the kind of honesty I found in that garden, or in the weeks since with the woman who now stands here, unable to hide her feelings even now, though I imagine she wishes desperately she could. I have had my fill of practical arrangements built on ambition rather than truth. I will not repeat that mistake a second time, however elegantly it is dressed." Charlotte opened her mouth once more, but seemed to think better of whatever protest she had intended, and instead pressed her lips into a thin, furious line, understanding at last that her performance had failed entirely and irreversibly. The Duke crossed the room toward Eleanor, and the assembled servants, sensing the private nature of what was about to unfold, quietly began to disperse back to their duties, leaving Charlotte standing alone and humiliated near the breakfast table, her earlier confidence entirely extinguished. "I owe you an apology," the Duke said quietly, once they stood facing one another with only the space of a few feet between them. "I should have spoken to you privately about what I had learned, rather than allowing this morning's confrontation to unfold as publicly as it did. I did not anticipate Charlotte's determination to force the matter into the open." "You have nothing to apologize for," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with the release of days of held tension. "I am the one who owes apologies. For every moment of silence, every evasion, every lie of omission I allowed to stand between us these past weeks." "You were protecting yourself in an impossible situation," he said gently. "I understand that, far better than you might imagine. What matters to me now is not the manner of your arrival here, but everything that has happened since. The woman who sat beside me in the garden, who defended her own dignity in that hallway 2 nights past, who chose honesty even when silence would have been so much easier. That is the woman I have come to care for, Eleanor. Not a name given to me by mistake, but the truth I discovered beneath it." Eleanor felt tears gathering, unbidden at the corners of her eyes, relief and disbelief tangling together until she could hardly separate one feeling from the other. "I do not know what happens now," she admitted softly. "My family will not be pleased. Charlotte's engagement, our family's reputation, everything they built this deception to protect. Let me worry about your family," the Duke said firmly, taking her hands gently in his own. "What I want to know, Eleanor, is what you wish for yourself, now that the truth stands fully between us with nothing left concealed." Eleanor looked up at him, at the steady warmth in his eyes, and understood, with a certainty that settled over her like the first true peace she had felt in weeks, exactly what her answer needed to be. "I wish to remain here," she said quietly, "not as a substitute for anyone, and not as a name my family assigned me to protect their own interests, but as myself, however uncertain that self may feel to you still. I have spent my entire life believing I was meant to occupy small, quiet corners of other people's lives, useful only when convenient and forgotten the rest of the time. These past weeks have been the first in as long as I can remember that I have felt truly seen, and I do not wish to give that feeling up simply because the truth of how I arrived here was complicated." The Duke's expression softened further, and he lifted one of her hands to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so tender that Eleanor felt her remaining composure nearly dissolve entirely. "Then you shall remain," he said, "for as long as you wish, and I hope, in time, for a good deal longer than that." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of brisk footsteps approaching, and both turned to find Aunt Beatrice standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her with evident satisfaction, rather than the surprise Eleanor might have expected. "I confess I have been listening from the corridor for the better part of this conversation," the older woman said without a trace of embarrassment. "An old woman's habits die hard, and I find eavesdropping considerably more informative than waiting to be told things secondhand. I must say, Julian, I suspected something was amiss the very first evening at dinner, when you spoke of the garden and this young woman's face showed nothing but confusion. You have always worn your heart rather plainly for a man who fancies himself so composed." "You suspected and said nothing?" the Duke asked, raising an eyebrow. "I suspected there was a story worth waiting for," Aunt Beatrice replied with a small, knowing smile, "and I find I was entirely correct. Whatever tangled circumstances brought you to this house, my dear," she added, turning her attention to Eleanor, "I have watched you these past days, and I have rarely seen a young woman conduct herself with such quiet grace, under such extraordinary pressure. I dare say you will make a far finer duchess than half the polished young women paraded before my nephew these past several seasons." Eleanor felt heat rush to her cheeks at the unexpected praise, though gratitude swelled warmly in her chest at the older woman's evident approval. "Thank you," she managed. "Your kindness means more than I can properly express." Aunt Beatrice waved a dismissive hand, though her eyes remained warm. "Kindness has little to do with it. I simply recognize good character when I see it, and I have seen precious little of it paraded through this house over the years. Now, I believe there is still the matter of your cousin to settle. She has retreated to her chamber in quite a state, and I imagine she will require transportation home sooner rather than later, before her presence causes any further complications." The Duke nodded, his expression turning businesslike once more. "I shall arrange for a carriage this afternoon. Whatever consequences Charlotte and her family face for this deception are matters best handled through proper correspondence rather than further confrontation in my home." Eleanor thought of her aunt and uncle, of the cold instructions in that letter, and felt a strange mixture of dread and something close to liberation settle over her. Whatever happened next, whatever anger or disappointment her family expressed, Eleanor understood that she was no longer entirely at their mercy. Not now, not standing here with the Duke's hand still warm around her own, and Aunt Beatrice's approval ringing in her ears. Charlotte departed that afternoon without another word to Eleanor, her earlier confidence replaced by a simmering, humiliated silence that spoke louder than any protest could have. Eleanor watched from the same upstairs window where she had first seen her cousin arrive, and felt, as the carriage disappeared down the long drive, not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settling relief that the deception her family had built was finally, fully unraveled, leaving nothing behind but the truth she had fought so hard to protect. That evening, the Duke found her once more in the garden, seated on the familiar stone bench beneath the old oak tree, and he settled beside her without a word, simply reaching for her hand in the gathering dusk. "I have been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence, "about the woman I met in this garden all those months ago. I spent so long searching for her, certain that finding her again would answer every question I carried about trust and honesty. But I find now that the answers I truly needed were never hers to give at all. They were yours, Eleanor, given freely these past weeks, long before I understood the difference." Eleanor turned to look at him, moonlight beginning to filter through the branches above them, and felt something settle fully into place within her chest, a certainty she had not allowed herself to trust until this very moment. "Perhaps," she said softly, "the garden was never truly about who stood in it that first night at all. Perhaps it was simply waiting for the right story to unfold within it, however long that took to arrive." He smiled at that, warm and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him, and leaned closer, and for the first time since her arrival at Ashworth Hall, Eleanor allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that whatever came next would be built on nothing but the truth. The letter from Whitfield Manor arrived a week later, and Eleanor recognized her uncle's heavy, formal hand on the envelope before she even broke the seal, her stomach tightening with the same old dread that had followed her since childhood whenever her family's disapproval loomed near. She read it alone in her chamber, and found, to her surprise, that the words carried less power over her than they once might have. Her uncle wrote with barely restrained fury, accusing her of destroying Charlotte's prospects, and dragging the family name through scandal, by allowing the deception to be exposed, rather than quietly ending the arrangement as instructed. He demanded she return home immediately to explain herself in person, and hinted darkly at consequences should she refuse. Eleanor set the letter down and walked to her window, looking out over the gardens that had come to feel, in the span of only a few short weeks, more like home than Whitfield Manor ever had. She thought of the years spent grateful for scraps of kindness, of a family that had used her convenience without once considering her feelings, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she owed them nothing further. She found the Duke in his study that afternoon, and showed him the letter without hesitation, no longer feeling the need to hide anything from him, however unpleasant. "My uncle wishes me to return and explain myself," she said, watching his expression darken as he read the accusations laid out in careful, angry script. "And what do you wish to do?" he asked, setting the letter aside. "I wish to write back," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, and explained that I owe them no further explanation. "They sent me here to serve their purposes, without once asking whether I wished to go, and when the truth threatened their comfort, they demanded I bury it quietly, rather than acknowledge the harm their scheme might cause. I will not apologize for choosing honesty over their convenience." The Duke's expression shifted into something like quiet pride. "Then we shall write that letter together, if you wish it, though I confess I have my own thoughts on the matter as well. Ones I believe your uncle will find considerably more difficult to dismiss than a young woman's polite refusal alone." They composed the response together that evening, the Duke's measured, formal language lending weight to Eleanor's own carefully chosen words. The letter made clear, in tones too dignified to be mistaken for anger, yet too firm to be mistaken for uncertainty, that Eleanor would not be returning to Whitfield Manor under any obligation, and that any further scandal arising from the family's own scheme rested entirely on choices made without her consent. The Duke added, almost as an afterthought that carried the weight of an anvil, that he considered Eleanor's future to be a matter now under his protection, and that any correspondence regarding her character or conduct should henceforth be directed to him personally. The reply that eventually came, weeks later, was considerably softer in tone, her aunt writing with careful, almost pleading words that suggested the family had reconsidered their position once the full weight of a Duke's displeasure had settled over their prospects in society. Eleanor read it with distant interest rather than anger, understanding that whatever relationship remained between herself and the family that raised her would never again carry the same power over her choices that it once had. Life at Ashworth Hall settled into a new rhythm in the weeks that followed, one built on honesty rather than careful performance. Eleanor found herself laughing more freely, speaking her true opinions without fear of contradiction, and watching the Duke's own guarded reserve soften further with each passing day, as though her honesty had given him permission to lower defenses he had carried for years. Aunt Beatrice remained at the estate longer than her usual visits typically allowed, claiming an interest in overseeing certain household matters, though Eleanor suspected the older woman simply enjoyed watching the courtship unfold with an enthusiasm she rarely displayed for anything else. She took to walking with Eleanor in the mornings, sharing stories of the Duke's childhood, of a boy who had once been considerably more open and trusting before the world taught him caution, and Eleanor treasured each story as a window into the man she was coming to love more deeply with every passing week. It was on a bright morning in early summer, nearly 2 months after Eleanor's arrival, that the Duke found her once again in the garden, this time not near the old oak tree but standing among the roses themselves, examining the blooms with quiet contentment. "I have a question for you," he said, approaching with a seriousness in his expression that made Eleanor's heart quicken immediately. "Ask it then," she said, turning to face him fully. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Eleanor's breath caught entirely as he opened it to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, catching the morning light with a soft, understated brilliance that suited her far better than anything ostentatious might have. "I asked you once, weeks ago, what you wished for yourself," he said, his voice steady, despite the visible emotion beneath it. "You told me you wished to remain here, as yourself, fully seen. I find I wish for the same thing, permanently, if you will have me. Not because fortune arranged our meeting through a mistake neither of us intended, but because everything since that mistake has been chosen freely, by both of us, again and again. Eleanor Vane, will you marry me?" Tears gathered freely in Eleanor's eyes as she looked at the man before her, a Duke who had once built an elaborate test around honesty and character, only to find both in a woman his own family had never valued highly enough to protect. She thought of every quiet evening in the library, every walk along the garden path, every moment he had chosen patience over pressure, protection over convenience, and she understood that her answer had been forming steadily within her heart since long before he ever asked the question aloud. "Yes," she said, the word carrying every ounce of certainty she felt. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite his usual composure, and when he drew her close and kissed her gently beneath the roses, Eleanor felt, for the first time in her entire life, as though she had finally found a place in the world that was entirely her own, chosen not out of convenience or family obligation, but out of genuine, hard-won love. Their wedding took place in early autumn, in the small stone chapel on the Ashworth estate, attended by a modest gathering that included Mrs. Pruitt, beaming with pride from a front pew she had been given despite her protests that servants ought not sit among such fine company, and Aunt Beatrice, who declared loudly enough for the entire chapel to hear that she had known from the very first evening that this match was destined to succeed. Eleanor's aunt and uncle attended as well, their earlier fury long since replaced by careful, practiced pleasantness, now that the marriage promised connections and advantages they had never anticipated from the plain cousin they once dismissed so easily. Eleanor greeted them with polite grace, neither warm nor cold, understanding that some relationships simply settled into new, more distant shapes once the truth of a person's worth had finally been revealed. Charlotte did not attend. Word had reached Ashworth Hall some weeks earlier that her own engagement had quietly dissolved once whispers of the garden deception spread further through society than the family had hoped to contain, and Eleanor felt no satisfaction in the news, only a distant, weary sympathy for a cousin who had spent her entire life valuing beauty and performance over the quieter, more lasting strength Eleanor had been forced to discover within herself. Standing at the altar in a simple gown that suited her far better than any elaborate finery Charlotte might have chosen, Eleanor looked into the eyes of the man who had chosen her, fully and completely, despite every complication her family's scheme had created, and felt nothing but gratitude for the strange, frightening path that had led her here. "I once told you," the Duke said quietly during the quiet moments before the ceremony began, "that I built the veil around a test of character, hoping to find a woman who valued honesty above appearance. I did not expect, when I sent for a stranger from a masquerade I barely remembered clearly, that I would instead find a woman who taught me what genuine honesty truly looked like, built slowly and courageously over weeks of impossible circumstance. And I never expected," Eleanor replied softly, "that a lie my family forced upon me would somehow lead me to the truest, most honest love I have ever known." They exchanged their vows beneath the soft autumn light filtering through the chapel windows, and when the ceremony concluded and they walked together back down the aisle as husband and wife, Eleanor felt the weight of every year spent unseen and unwanted finally lift entirely from her shoulders, replaced by a future built not on borrowed names or convenient arrangements, but on the simple, powerful truth of a woman finally, fully known and chosen for exactly who she was. The years that followed brought Eleanor a life she had never dared imagine during those long, lonely years at Whitfield Manor. She became not merely a duchess but a genuine partner to her husband, her opinions sought and valued in matters both large and small, her quiet strength becoming, in time, one of the estate's most trusted resources. Mrs. Pruitt remained a cherished friend, rather than simply a member of the household staff, and Aunt Beatrice visited often, delighting in watching the young couple's happiness deepen with each passing season. And though her family's scheme had once threatened to bury her entirely beneath someone else's story, Eleanor understood, standing in the gardens of Ashworth Hall on quiet mornings with her husband beside her, that the deception which began as her family's convenient plan had ultimately given her something far greater than they ever intended. A chance to be seen, valued, and loved, not for a borrowed name or a stolen identity, but for the honest, resilient woman she had always been, waiting patiently beneath the veil for someone finally willing to look closely enough to see her. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding itself, Eleanor found herself settling into the estate in a manner entirely different from her uncertain arrival months earlier. She no longer walked the corridors of Ashworth Hall with careful, measured steps, afraid of drawing attention to some misstep that might expose her. Instead, she began to take genuine ownership of small corners of the household, consulting with Mrs. Pruitt about the arrangement of the winter gardens, offering her opinion freely during discussions of the estate's tenant matters, and discovering, to her quiet delight, that the Duke valued her judgment as much as he valued her company. He took her into the county on several occasions during those weeks, introducing her properly to neighbors and acquaintances, not as a mysterious veiled guest, but as his intended wife, and Eleanor watched with growing confidence as she learned to navigate conversations that had once terrified her, with an ease she never imagined possible. The fear of exposure that had haunted her earliest days at Ashworth Hall gradually faded into memory, replaced by the simple, steady comfort of being known fully and accepted regardless. She wrote once more to Whitfield Manor before the wedding, not out of obligation but out of a genuine, if complicated, desire to extend an olive branch toward the family that had raised her, however imperfectly. She invited her aunt and uncle to attend the ceremony, making clear that their presence was welcome but not required, and that her own happiness no longer depended on their approval one way or another. The response arrived swiftly, and Eleanor read the careful, almost humbled acceptance with a strange mixture of satisfaction and lingering sadness for a relationship that had never quite given her what a family ought to offer. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a pleasant blur of preparation, Aunt Beatrice taking charge of many of the smaller details with the enthusiasm of a woman who had waited a long time to see her nephew settled happily, and Mrs. Pruitt overseeing the household staff with quiet efficiency, ensuring every detail of the ceremony and the small celebration to follow would proceed without incident. On the morning of the wedding itself, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chamber, dressed in a simple gown of pale gold that Mrs. Pruitt had helped select weeks earlier, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of the veil she had worn on her very first evening at Ashworth Hall, trembling and terrified, certain that her deception would be discovered within days. She thought of how far she had traveled since that frightened arrival, not merely in the physical distance from Whitfield Manor, but in the far greater distance from a woman who believed herself unworthy of being truly seen, to a woman standing confidently before her own wedding day, chosen entirely and completely for exactly who she was. The ceremony itself passed in a warm haze of joy, vows exchanged with steady voices and eyes that never wavered from one another, and when Eleanor and her husband finally emerged from the chapel as a married couple, the small gathering of guests erupted into genuine warm applause that felt entirely different from the polite, calculated approval Eleanor had grown accustomed to during her years at Whitfield Manor. The small celebration that followed at Ashworth Hall carried none of the stiff formality Eleanor had feared might accompany such an occasion. Aunt Beatrice regaled the gathered guests with stories of the Duke's childhood, drawing warm laughter from even the more reserved attendees, while Mrs. Pruitt moved quietly among the staff, ensuring every detail proceeded smoothly, occasionally catching Eleanor's eye across the room with a proud, motherly smile that meant more to Eleanor than she could easily express. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests began to depart, Eleanor found herself once more in the garden with her husband, the same garden that had witnessed so much of their story unfold, from confusion to honesty to love freely chosen. They walked slowly along the familiar stone path beneath a sky scattered with early stars, and Eleanor felt a peace settle over her unlike anything she had known before. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that the woman you met here that first night, whoever she truly was, would be pleased to know how this story finally unfolded?" The Duke considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think," he said finally, "that whoever she was, she gave me a gift without ever knowing it, a reminder that honesty still existed in a world I had grown to distrust. But the story that followed, the one that truly mattered, was never hers to finish. It was always meant to be yours." Eleanor smiled, leaning into him as they continued their slow walk beneath the stars, and understood, with complete and settled certainty, that whatever mysteries remained unanswered about that first fateful night no longer held any real importance. What mattered was everything that had grown since, patiently and honestly, between two people who had chosen each other again and again, long after any lie could have sustained them, until only the truth remained standing between them, stronger and more lasting than any story her family could ever have invented. A year into her marriage, Eleanor received a visitor she had never expected to see again, and the sight of the woman standing at the door of Ashworth Hall, thinner and considerably more subdued than Eleanor remembered, brought a rush of complicated feelings she had not prepared herself to face. Charlotte stood in the entrance hall, her traveling clothes plain and practical rather than the elaborate silks she had once favored, and for a long moment neither woman spoke, the weight of everything unresolved between them filling the space more thoroughly than words could have. "I did not know where else to go," Charlotte finally said, her voice lacking the sharp confidence Eleanor remembered so vividly from their last encounter. "My engagement dissolved, as you likely heard, and my parents have grown considerably colder toward me since, blaming me for the scandal, nearly as much as they blamed you. I have nowhere left that feels like home." Eleanor studied her cousin carefully, searching for some trace of the old cruelty, some hidden motive behind this unexpected arrival, but found instead only genuine exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like humility, an expression Eleanor had never once seen on Charlotte's face during all their years growing up together. "Come in," Eleanor said finally, stepping aside to allow her cousin entry, though caution still lingered beneath her hospitality. "We can speak properly, away from the drafts of this hallway." She led Charlotte to the same small sitting room where she herself had once sought comfort from Mrs. Pruitt, and ordered tea before settling into the chair across from her cousin, waiting patiently for whatever explanation Charlotte had traveled so far to deliver. "I owe you an apology," Charlotte said eventually, twisting her hands together in a gesture so unlike her usual composed elegance that Eleanor found herself genuinely startled by it. "Not merely for the scheme our parents devised, though I played my part in that willingly enough at the time, but for the cruelty I showed you in this very house, when I tried to claim a story that was never mine simply to protect my own comfort." Eleanor said nothing for a moment, weighing the sincerity of the words against years of accumulated resentment. "Why come to me with this now, Charlotte? A year has passed. You could have written, if apology was truly your purpose." "Because writing would have been easier," Charlotte admitted, "and I no longer wish to take the easier path when it came to you. I have spent this past year reflecting on the choices that led me here, and I find I do not like the woman those choices revealed me to be. You showed more courage in a few short weeks at Ashworth Hall than I have shown in my entire life, and I think, if I am honest, I resented you for it far more than I resented the scheme itself." The admission hung in the air between them, and Eleanor found herself softening slightly despite years of guarded distance. She thought of the woman she had become since her own frightened arrival at this house, how much the truth had cost her, and how much more it had ultimately given her in return, and she wondered whether some measure of that same transformation might yet be possible for her cousin. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked, her tone gentler than before. "I do not entirely know," Charlotte admitted. "My parents wish me to accept whatever match can still be arranged, regardless of my own feelings on the matter, much as they once arranged things for you without your consent. I find myself, for the first time, unwilling to simply accept whatever role is handed to me without question." Eleanor considered her cousin for a long moment, memories of their shared childhood surfacing unexpectedly, moments before ambition and family pressure had hardened Charlotte into someone Eleanor had grown to fear rather than trust. Beneath the cruelty and the schemes, there had once been simply two girls raised in the same uncertain household, shaped by the same demanding expectations, however differently those expectations had ultimately marked them. "You are welcome to stay here a while," Eleanor offered finally, surprising herself with the genuine warmth in her own voice. "Not indefinitely, and not without honest conversation between us about everything that has passed, but long enough, perhaps, to consider what you truly wish for yourself, away from your parents' pressure and away from whatever expectations society still holds for you." Charlotte's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I did not expect such kindness, not after everything. I know what it is to be shaped entirely by other people's plans," Eleanor said quietly. "I would not wish that fate on anyone, even you." When the Duke returned from his business in the county that evening, and found Charlotte settled quietly in the drawing room, he raised an eyebrow in silent question toward Eleanor, though he said nothing in front of their unexpected guest. Later, once Charlotte had retired for the evening, he sought Eleanor out in their private chambers, curiosity evident in his expression. "I confess I did not anticipate finding your cousin beneath our roof again," he said, settling into the chair near their fireplace. "May I ask what changed your mind toward her?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I spent a great deal of this past year understanding what it means to be truly seen, truly valued, for exactly who I am, rather than the role assigned to me. I do not believe Charlotte has ever had that experience, not once in her entire life. Perhaps offering her the smallest chance at it costs me little, and perhaps it might change something meaningful for her, as it once changed everything for me." The Duke studied his wife with evident admiration, reaching across the small distance to take her hand gently in his own. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly. "Even after a full year of marriage, I married a woman who chose honesty over convenience when it would have been so much easier to remain silent, and I find I continue to discover new depths to that same courage with each passing season." Eleanor smiled, leaning into his warmth. "Perhaps kindness is simply another form of honesty," she said. "A refusal to pretend that cruelty, however tempting, is truly who I wish to become." Over the following weeks, Charlotte's presence at Ashworth Hall gradually shifted from awkward tension into something resembling genuine, if still tentative, connection between the two cousins. Eleanor watched as Charlotte began spending time with Mrs. Pruitt in the gardens, learning small practical skills she had never bothered to acquire during her years focused entirely on securing an advantageous match. She watched her cousin's sharp edges soften gradually, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful version of the woman Eleanor remembered from childhood, before ambition had fully taken hold. By the time autumn arrived once more, marking a full year since Eleanor's own wedding, Charlotte had decided, with newfound confidence entirely her own, to pursue a quiet position as a companion to an elderly relation in the north, choosing independence over whatever arranged match her parents might still attempt to secure for her. Eleanor helped her prepare for the journey, and on the morning of her departure, the two cousins embraced with a warmth that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. "I hope you find whatever peace you are searching for," Eleanor said, holding her cousin's hands tightly. "I hope the same for you," Charlotte replied, "though I suspect, watching you these past weeks, that you have already found it more completely than I ever imagined possible for either of us." As Charlotte's carriage disappeared down the long drive, Eleanor stood beside her husband in the same spot where she had once watched her cousin arrive with such devastating confidence, determined to claim a story that had never truly belonged to her. So much had changed since that frightened morning, and Eleanor understood now, with the settled wisdom of a year spent building an honest life, that the true story had never been about veils or gardens or mistaken identities at all. It had always been about two people willing to choose honesty, again and again, even when silence would have been so much easier, and about a family's careless scheme ultimately unable to bury the simple, enduring truth of who Eleanor had always been, waiting patiently for someone willing to finally see her clearly. Her husband's hand found hers as the carriage vanished from sight, and together they turned back toward the house that had become, in every meaning that truly mattered, entirely and permanently her home. That evening, Aunt Beatrice arrived for one of her frequent visits, and over a quiet dinner she listened with evident interest, as Eleanor recounted the changes she had witnessed in Charlotte over the past several weeks. The older woman nodded slowly, thoughtful in a way that suggested she was turning something important over in her mind. "You know," Aunt Beatrice said eventually, setting down her fork, "I have watched a great many families over the years build their fortunes on schemes and calculations, believing that ambition alone could secure lasting happiness. I have rarely seen such schemes end well, and I confess I worried greatly for you both when the truth of your arrangement first came to light. But I find myself increasingly convinced that the finest things in life are rarely the ones we plan for carefully. They are the ones that arrive sideways, through mistakes and misunderstandings, and reveal themselves as gifts only once we have the courage to accept them honestly." Eleanor smiled at the observation, thinking of her own frightened arrival at Ashworth Hall so long ago, trembling beneath a veil that was never truly hers, terrified of a discovery that ultimately became the very foundation of everything good in her life since. "I could not agree more," she said, glancing toward her husband, who returned her gaze with the same steady warmth she had come to treasure above all else. "I arrived here as someone else's mistake, and I leave each day now, more certain than the last, that it was the finest mistake my family ever made, however unintentionally." The Duke raised his glass toward her in a quiet, private toast, and Aunt Beatrice, never one to miss an opportunity for sentiment, raised her own glass as well, declaring loudly that she intended to tell this particular story to every acquaintance she encountered for years to come, embellished only slightly for the sake of a livelier telling. Later that night, once the house had quieted and Aunt Beatrice had retired to her usual chamber, Eleanor stood once more at the window of the room she now shared fully with her husband, looking out over gardens bathed in soft moonlight, the same gardens that had witnessed every turn of her extraordinary journey from frightened impostor to beloved wife. She thought of the countless women throughout history who had been sent into unfamiliar houses wearing names and expectations not entirely their own, forced to navigate impossible circumstances with little control over their own fates. She thought of how easily her own story might have ended differently, had she chosen silence over honesty, had the Duke chosen suspicion over patience, had either of them allowed fear to overrule the slow, careful trust that had grown between them despite every obstacle placed in their path. But their story had not ended that way, and standing now in the quiet comfort of a home built on truth rather than convenient deception, Eleanor understood that whatever trials still lay ahead in the years of marriage before them, she faced them now not as a frightened woman wearing someone else's identity, but as herself entirely, chosen and cherished for exactly who she had always been beneath every veil her family had ever asked her to wear.